At dawn, out of the fog along the Carolina coast, a wounded German shepherd limped toward the police station lights. His fur was torn, streaked with scars and dried blood, and between his teeth he carried a single police boot, its leather soaked in crimson. He shouldn't have been there. No one expected a stray dog to walk up to the Seabridge Police Department that morning. But in his eyes burned something words could never hold. A message, a memory, and a mission. Behind the mist and the burned forest beyond town, 3 missing officers had vanished without a trace. Everyone else had given up hope. Everyone except this dog. What happened next would break your heart and prove that loyalty can outlive even fire and fear. Before we begin, tell me where you're watching from. And if you believe no officer, no soul, and no animal should ever be left behind, hit that subscribe button, because this story might just renew your faith in miracles. Dawn settled over Seabridge, North Carolina, like a gray quilt pulled tight across the harbor, the Atlantic breathing in and out beyond the breakwater, while mist climbed Harbor Street and softened the edges of everything it touched. The gulls that scribbled the air, the peeled paint bait shops, the old lighthouse crouched on its stone ribs. The lamps along the pier ticked off one by one, surrendering to a pale light that carried the smell of salt and wet iron, and a bell far out on the water tolled once and went quiet. It was a morning built for silence and steady work. Sergeant Mason Hale had the gait because he liked that kind of morning. He was 42, built thick through the chest and shoulders, with wrists like dowels and hands nicked by old jobs he didn't catalog. His hair was brown, shading lighter at the temples, his jaw square beneath a daily stubble he never quite conquered before sunrise. There was a seam down the right eyebrow where a bottle had found him during a bar call years back. And there was another seam, the kind you can't see, from a night he wished had ended sooner. People read him as quiet and slow to anger, which was mostly true. What they didn't see was that he counted things. The beats between thunder and lightning, the time it took a rookie to breathe after bad news, the small distances that decide whether a person lives. He sipped the last metallic inch of coffee and listened to the town come awake in small pieces, which is why the sound reached him first. A soft, uneven tick on asphalt. Not quite steps and not quite a drag, like a metronome someone had bumped. Mason set the cup down and turned toward Harbor Street as a shape pressed itself out of the fog. Low, deliberate, listing slightly with each stride. A German shepherd, big-boned and sharp-eared, coat the color of storm water with a black saddle darker than the rest, and old scars cataracting one shoulder where fur had grown back thin. The dog favored the left forepaw. With every step a faint smear of crimson marked the pavement. Between his teeth he carried a single police boot, laces torn and dark, leather soaked where blood had dried to a varnish. He shouldn't have been there. Dogs don't walk into stations with evidence. But he kept coming, eyes a tired amber that held and didn't blink, until 6 feet from the gatehouse he stopped and set the boot down with a wet, heavy sound. He didn't bark. He didn't tremble. He sat, back straight, as if he had learned somewhere to wait for doors to open. Mason let the quiet hold for 1 breath. 2, because sometimes people tell you more if you give them space, and sometimes animals do too. Then he keyed the radio. "Gate to command, I've got a situation you want eyes on. Non-hostile, urgent." He gave the short version and the longer truth. Dog, boot, blood, then looked again at the animal. Up close the dog was no yard pet wandering on luck. The teeth were worn but sound, the claws clipped not. Long ago, the coat clean where it wasn't bloodied. That old shoulder scar didn't come from a fence, it came from work. The pad on the injured paw was split, raw and bright as a fresh-cut apple. "Easy, buddy," Mason said in the tone he used for people after an accident, steady and unafraid. "We see you." Lieutenant Grant Calloway crossed the bullpen with a paper cup and the kind of focus that quiets rooms without a raised voice. 45, tall, long-legged in a way that suggested distance running, but with the parade ground stillness of a man who knew when not to move. His hair was almost black, cut close, silver beginning at the temples, and his face had the lean planes that weather and a lot of dark coffee carve. Diagonal cheekbones, a straight nose, a mouth that tried to keep things measured. Grant's people said he was calm. What they meant was that he chose his temperature on purpose. He stepped out to the gate, set his coffee aside, and knelt so the dog wouldn't have to look up far. The toe tag on the boot was scuffed but readable through mud and dried blood. Ramirez M. The name dropped through the floor of Grant's chest and landed hard. Officer Miguel Ramirez was 24, 5'9", with a square, open face that went from cautious to warm in one beat when he decided you were trying. A second-year patrolman who worked the night grid like it was a promise he intended to keep. Son of migrant workers out of Laredo, first in his family with a badge. The kind who re-stitched his duty gloves instead of requisitioning new and loaned rookies his extra pen without making it a sermon. Ramirez had been second car on Bravo Team's overnight patrol. Dispatch had lost clean contact at 02 Oduasaum. After that, only pings where the ridge went to black glass 7 summers back, when lightning lit the timber like a field of matchsticks. Grant turned the boot and studied the lacing. 3 tight overhand knots, doubled and jammed, the tag ends tucked short, a small loop pulled and flattened like it was meant to be noticed. There are ways to send a message when radios fail and batteries die. Sometimes a boot can travel where a man cannot. He didn't say that aloud. He set the boot down with care, rinsed his voice of everything it wanted to carry, and said, "All right." To Mason. "Where from?" Mason pointed with his chin into the fog. "Harbor Street, straight line, he came with purpose." "Water and saline," Grant said. "Towel." He spoke into the radio. "Calloway, pull Harbor to 4th Street cams for the last hour. Maintain hail on Bravo. Page Maddox on call. Keep county advised, and do not spook the dog." The animal watched him, ears ticking toward the building, then forward again, as if holding 2 channels at once. Yvette Moran from patrol jogged over with a field kit. Compact, sleeves rolled, hair braided close, a medic who didn't waste motion. She rinsed the pad clean, wrapped 2 turns of gauze and tape, and touched the dog's shoulder in a quiet way that said, "Done." Muscle tensed once under her palm, and then eased like he knew competence when he felt it. Detective Cole Maddox appeared behind her with a legal pad and a face that had decided to leave some stories out. 39, wiry under a charcoal sport coat that wore a shoulder holster like it was part of the pattern. Tight brown curls kept to regulation. A jawline that carried a faint seam from a night in a different desert. He didn't talk about unless there was a reason. Cole's eyes were the color of fresh coffee, and a little tired. He took in dog, boot, blood, the quiet, and wrote 3 words that would make sense later. Inside, the station warmed into itself. Phones found their rhythm. The copier coughed. Someone laughed once at something small because that's how daylight starts in rooms that see too much. On the corridor corkboard, crayon drawings of blue uniforms and dogs with heroic paws sat under a flyer for the school toy drive. Mason had noticed Ramirez stop there more than once, smile without showing teeth, and keep moving like a man saving his better parts for the street. Grant crouched again. "You brought this for us," he said to the dog, keeping his voice low and steady. "We hear you, friend." The dog's eyes didn't shift. He sat a little forward on his haunches, like every line of him urged motion the way a compass needle urges north. Dispatch crackled in Grant's ear. Still no voice contact with Bravo. Last clean location a smear near the burn line. The ridge out there had been turned to charcoal 7 years ago, and even now the black trunks stood like ribs on a beach no tide reached. People told stories because people need stories where there are scars, and some of those stories were useful because they warned you how the wind worked in that cut of land and how sound died under the ash. Grant stood. He didn't check with a committee. "We form up," he said. 2 units, med kits and stretchers. Moran with Maddox, Hale with me and Keaton. Notify County SAR, but we don't wait." There was a stillness after he said it, the kind of stillness that happens when the simple plan is also the only moral one. Mason nodded once. Yvette shouldered her kit. Cole tucked his pad. The dog rose like the words had clipped a lead to something only he could feel. He took the boot again by the tongue and turned toward the street, favoring the bandaged paw but moving with a stiff, practiced economy that looked a lot like training and a lot like stubbornness. Grant keyed the gate. It slid back with a breathy rattle. For a second, the fog made a pale corridor between the station and the town, a thin runway of mourning in which everything seemed about to choose itself. Grant spoke on the air, even and spare. "All units, stand by for search and rescue deployment. We have a lead on Bravo. Repeat, we have a lead." Then to the dog, quiet enough that only Mason and the wind could hear, "Show us!" The animal's ears pricked. He looked once at Mason, not pleading and not afraid, but carrying a message older than words, the same message you hear in weather if you've lived near water long enough, and in horses if you've worked a field, and in the way the ocean changes its sound at night. Come. Now. Mason felt the old seam tug through him, the one a man gets from staying too long in rooms where people need him. He adjusted his belt, checked the tourniquet pouch he always checked, and stepped into the corridor of fog behind the dog, who had arrived with blood and silence and a single boot, and who, for reasons none of them yet knew, refused to let anyone vanish. The road that led out of Seabridge narrowed as it climbed toward the northern ridge, a cracked ribbon of asphalt that shimmered faintly beneath the morning mist. Beyond the last stretch of houses, the smell of the ocean thinned, replaced by the acrid scent of soot and pine resin that never quite faded, even after 7 years. The locals still called it the burn zone, a scar left by the lightning storm that had turned 5 square miles of forest into a graveyard of trees. Lieutenant Grant Calloway drove the lead SUV, hands fixed at 10 and 2, his jaw tight but his gaze steady. The old Dodge hummed low, its radio alive with static. Mason Hale sat in the passenger seat beside him, eyes on the dirt road ahead, one hand resting near his holstered sidearm. Not out of fear, but habit. In the back, Detective Cole Maddox leaned against the window, jotting shorthand notes in his small black notebook, while Officer Ryan Keaton sat beside him, helmet in his lap, boot tapping a nervous rhythm on the floor. The dog, Ranger, rode in the rear crate, silent, his amber eyes fixed on the horizon. The convoy turned off onto a gravel trail marked by a faded, restricted access sign. Mason cracked the window and felt the air change, colder, thinner, carrying the faint metallic sting of something long burned. "Still smells like it happened yesterday," he murmured. Calloway nodded. "Fire never really leaves," he said. "It just waits underground." Ranger shifted behind them, low growl rumbling in his chest as though he understood the words. Mason turned slightly, meeting the dog's gaze through the mesh divider. The bandage on Ranger's paw was streaked with dirt, but his posture remained proud, his head high, ears twitching at every creak and whisper beyond the glass. Cole Maddox spoke without looking up from his notes. "Dog's tracking something. Look at the ears. He's locked in. Whatever brought him here, he's retracing it. Cole's voice carried the dry rasp of too many cigarettes and too little rest, the tone of a man who had learned to speak only when he had something worth saying. Ryan glanced at him, his young face pale in the dim cabin light. You really think he knows where he's going? Cole's eyes flicked toward the rookie. You ever doubt a compass that bleeds? Ryan tried to smile, but didn't quite make it. He was 23, fresh from the academy, lean and lanky, with short brown hair that curled at the edges, and the kind of honest face that hadn't yet learned how to lie to grief. His father had been a sheriff in Tennessee, killed in a roadside ambush when Ryan was 12. It was that loss, the sound of a folded flag and a mother's quiet sob, that had pushed him into the uniform. But the field still scared him. The silence of places like this felt too much like memory. They drove another mile before Calloway slowed the SUV to a crawl. The black trees rose like ribs on both sides of the trail, charred, trunks stretching high, their branches broken and sharp. The ground was layered with brittle ash that shifted like sand under the tires. Even the wind sounded muted, as if afraid to disturb the place. Ranger began to whine, a low, insistent sound. Mason felt the hair on his arms rise. He wants out, he said. Calloway pulled over near a collapsed fire line. The team stepped out, boots sinking slightly into the soft gray earth. The air was dry and cold enough that every breath came out white. Mason opened the rear door. Ranger leapt down stiffly but sure-footed, nose pressed to the ground. His tail was low, not fearful, but focused. Cole scanned the tree line through the scope of his flashlight. This is the burn perimeter, he said. Bravo's last ping was right around here. Ranger began to move, slow and deliberate, following a scent none of them could sense. He stopped at the edge of a ditch where black soil met a scatter of old debris, metal scraps, melted glass, and the twisted remains of a road sign that once read, Forest Road 7. The dog pawed at the dirt, then looked back, growling once. Mason crouched beside him, flashlight sweeping the ground. What do you see, boy? Something caught the beam. Fabric, a scrap of navy blue material wedged under a stone, singed at the edges. Mason pulled it free carefully, shaking off the soot. It was a fragment of ballistic nylon, the kind used for body armor. The lettering was faint, but still visible. M. Ramirez. Ryan swallowed hard. Jesus! Cole knelt next to him, taking the piece in gloved hands. The weaves burned through on one side, he muttered. There's impact scoring, too. Looks like shrapnel or a close-range blast. Mason's throat tightened. He'd trained Ramirez on perimeter protocol. The kid had been careful, cautious to the point of annoyance. Seeing his name here felt wrong, like an unfinished sentence. He didn't go down easy, Mason said quietly. Calloway crouched beside them, the lines around his mouth deepening. No one gets left here, he said, his voice low, resolute. Bag it, tag it, mark GPS. As Ryan sealed the evidence pouch, the forest around them exhaled a long, dry whisper. Branches shifted in the distance, though there was no wind. Cole's head snapped up, scanning the shadows. Movement, northwest, he said. Mason turned, hand resting on his weapon. The light swung across the tree line, nothing but ash and the faint ghost of smoke rising from the cold earth. Ranger stood rigid, fur bristling, nose pointing toward a dark gully that split the hillside. He barked once, sharp and clipped. Let him lead, Calloway said. They followed the dog into the narrow gully, their boots crunching through soot and charred pine cones. The ground sloped downward into a hollow where the remains of a wooden bridge lay half-collapsed. The smell of burned resin grew stronger, mixing with something newer, damp soil and faint rot. Ranger slowed, sniffed the air, and let out a low whine. Cole swept his flashlight along the rocks and stopped. "There," he said. Half buried under a tangle of fallen branches was a shattered police radio. Its casing was cracked, its antenna bent nearly flat. The serial tag was melted, but the channel frequency, Bravo 3, was still etched faintly across the panel. Mason knelt beside it, brushing off the ash. "He tried to call," he murmured. "He got this far." Calloway looked back up the ridge toward the black silhouettes of the trees. "And if he made it this far, maybe someone else did too." The words hung in the air like a command. The wind picked up then, carrying fine ash through the beam of their flashlights like drifting snow. For a moment, the forest seemed alive again, whispering with the memory of flame. Ryan's voice broke the silence. "Sir, what if that dog belonged to one of them?" Calloway's eyes followed Ranger, who stood at the edge of the creek bed, staring into the distance. "Then he's come home," he said. "And he's trying to finish what they started." Ranger gave a soft bark, as if answering, and started up the slope again, leaving prints in the ash. The team followed, their shadows stretching long behind them. The deeper they went, the less the world felt like the one they'd left behind. No bird calls, no insects, just the rasp of boots and the rhythm of the dog's labored breathing. When they reached the crest, the land opened into a clearing. In the middle, half sunk in soot, lay what had once been a road barricade, now blackened and warped. Mason swept the beam of his light across it and froze. Scrawled in the soot with something sharp, carved deep into the metal, were 3 words. "Help, still alive." No one spoke. The only sound was the brittle sigh of wind through burned pines and Ranger's steady panting beside them. Calloway exhaled slowly. "This isn't a search anymore," he said. "It's a rescue." And under the ghost-white moonlight filtering through the mist, Ranger lifted his head, ears pricked toward the darkness beyond the clearing, as though he already knew where the living still waited. The sun had barely broken through the veil of mist when the team reached the ridge. The ash-colored ground seemed endless, and each step left behind a faint ghost of a footprint that vanished in seconds, swallowed by dust and cold air. Sergeant Mason Hale led the way now, his eyes narrowing against the pale glare as the burned pines rose like black fingers clawing at the sky. Behind him, Lieutenant Grant Calloway kept pace, his rifle strapped tight against his shoulder, his expression calm but drawn. They had been moving for nearly an hour since finding the barricade with its carved play. "Help, still alive." The message haunted every breath. Ranger trotted ahead, limping but relentless, the bandaged paw pressing into the earth with quiet determination. His fur caught the gray light, revealing streaks of lighter hair along his back, the faint silver that came with age. He moved with purpose, not hesitation, as though the forest itself whispered directions only he could understand. The group followed in silence, the only sound the crunch of boots and the occasional creak of their packs. Cole Maddox walked behind them, scanning the horizon through a pair of old binoculars, scratched from years of use. He had been silent most of the hike, his face unreadable. His jaw worked lightly as he chewed on an old toothpick, a habit that had followed him from his military days in Fallujah. There was something in his eyes that morning, something that flickered between focus and memory. Ryan Keaton trailed just behind, sweat cutting small, clean streaks through the soot on his cheeks. He tried not to think about the message carved into the barricade, but the words replayed in his mind like a broken record. "Help, still alive." He swallowed hard and looked at Ranger again. "How's he even walking on that paw?" he whispered, almost to himself. Mason didn't turn. "Because he's got somewhere to go," he said simply. The air grew heavier as they descended into a narrow ravine. The ground underfoot changed from powdery ash to damp soil streaked with black veins of charcoal. A faint trickle of water ran along the rocks, glinting faintly like spilled mercury. Ranger slowed, nose twitching, tail stiff. He gave one sharp bark, then padded toward a cluster of jagged stones wedged between two collapsed tree trunks. Calloway raised a hand to halt the team. "Easy," he said, voice low. He moved forward with Mason beside him, both men crouched, scanning the shadows. Ranger sniffed at the stones, then began pawing furiously at the dirt between them. Ash and mud flew as his claws worked with desperate rhythm. Mason dropped to one knee, brushing the debris aside. Something metallic glinted through the grime, a bent police radio, its antenna snapped clean. Mason's heart tightened. "It's one of ours," he said. Cole moved in closer, flashlight beam cutting through the murk. "Looks like it's been down a day, maybe 2, he murmured. "Batteries. Dead!" Ranger barked again, short, urgent, and pushed his snout deeper between the rocks. His body trembled with effort, whining low, insistent. Mason leaned closer, pressing an ear near the dark gap. At first he heard only the slow drip of water and the faint rasp of his own breathing. Then, something else. A sound so weak it could have been mistaken for wind. A voice. He froze. "Calloway," he whispered, eyes wide. "There's someone down there." The lieutenant knelt beside him, ear pressed close. For a long second there was only silence, and then a rasping murmur, faint but unmistakable. "2 deeper." Ryan's breath caught. "Sir, did he say 2 deeper?" Calloway nodded slowly, his voice firm but hushed. "He did." They began clearing the entrance, Mason and Cole pulling rocks aside, Ryan hauling dirt with his hands. The hole widened, releasing a wave of cold, stale air that smelled of iron and decay. A flashlight beam cut inside and caught the faint shimmer of a uniform. "Lawson," Mason breathed. Officer Derek Lawson lay wedged against the rock wall, his body half covered by rubble. His face was gray with dust, a streak of dried blood running from his hairline down his cheek. His eyes fluttered open as Mason reached for his shoulder. "Easy, brother," Mason said softly. "We've got you." Lawson tried to speak, but coughed instead, his voice barely a whisper. He was in his late 20s, compact and solid, with close-cropped black hair and pale blue eyes that once carried quiet humor, but now glistened with exhaustion. His uniform was torn across the chest, exposing a cracked radio and the frayed strap of his vest. Mason saw the tag, Lawson D., and swallowed hard. "Stay with us, Derek," Calloway said, kneeling beside him. "You're safe now?" Lawson's hand twitched weakly, fingers brushing at the broken radio near his chest. "Ramirez," he gasped. "He tried to send the signal." Cole checked his pulse. Weak, but there. "He's dehydrated, hypothermic," he said quickly. "We need fluids now." Ryan fumbled through his pack, pulling out a water pouch. Mason steadied Lawson's head and let a trickle run across his lips. The officer swallowed, eyes fluttering. His voice came out thin, fragile as paper. "2 deeper," he repeated. Calloway leaned closer. "Where, Lawson? Who?" But Lawson's head fell back, his breath hitching. "2 deeper." The last word faded to a sigh. He wasn't gone, just spent. Cole exhaled sharply. "That's not random. It's direction. 2 more alive, deeper in." Mason met Calloway's gaze. "Then we don't stop here." Calloway nodded. "We stabilize him, get him to the vehicle, then go back in. Cole, you stay with him until extraction." Ryan looked torn. "Sir, we can't just split." "You'll stay with me and Mason," Calloway cut in. We move fast, that's an order. Cole didn't argue. Hoist began setting up a quick field dressing, wrapping Lawson's ribs and bandaging the wound on his leg. The detective's movements were methodical, efficient, hands steady even as his jaw clenched tight. Mason could see it in his eyes. He'd patched too many people like this before. Ranger lay down beside Lawson, pressing his scarred shoulder gently against the officer's side, as though lending him his strength. Mason watched for a moment and felt a lump in his throat. Ryan whispered, "He knows him." "Maybe," Mason replied. "Or maybe he just knows pain when he sees it." When the stretcher was finally ready, they lifted Lawson carefully. As they carried him toward the ridge, the forest grew quieter still. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Calloway walked beside Mason, his eyes on the gray horizon. "You think Ramirez is gone?" Mason shook his head. "Not until that dog stops walking." At the ridge, Cole stayed behind with Lawson, setting up a flare to signal the med team. Calloway, Mason, and Ryan turned back toward the forest. Ranger stood waiting at the edge of the trail, eyes fixed into the distance, tail low but steady. He looked back once as if to say, "We're not done." Mason adjusted his rifle strap, the ache in his shoulders matching the weight in his chest. "All right, old boy," he said quietly. "Lead the way." And as they disappeared once more into the scarred forest, the sound of their boots faded into the breath of ash, and the burned land seemed to whisper around them, of fire, of memory, and of 2 more lives waiting somewhere ahead. The forest thickened as the sun fell behind the ridge, turning the burned landscape into a patchwork of gray light and creeping shadow. Lieutenant Grant Calloway checked his watch, just after 6. The mist had returned, rolling low and heavy, softening the black stumps that marked where trees once stood. The air was colder now, each breath turning visible before fading into the haze. The group moved carefully. Calloway, Sergeant Mason Hale, young officer Ryan Keaton, and the old German Shepherd Ranger, who limped ahead with quiet resolve. The smell of smoke still lingered in the ground, an invisible ghost that refused to leave even after 7 years. Calloway paused, scanning the tree line. His face, usually calm and composed, was streaked with dirt, the fine ash clinging to the lines around his eyes. His voice was low when he spoke. "We're close. You feel it?" Mason nodded. "Yeah." The silence changed. It was true. The forest had gone still, not the natural hush of wilderness, but the wary quiet that follows human presence. Even the wind had drawn back. Ranger stopped suddenly near a cluster of twisted trunks, nose pressed to the ground, ears twitching. He whined once, then turned sharply to the left, leading them toward a slope of blackened soil that dropped into a shallow hollow. There, half hidden by fallen timber and creeping moss, stood a cabin. The structure leaned as if exhausted, its roof half collapsed, the boards warped from fire and rain. Smoke scars licked up the sides, and the small window panes were opaque with grime. A rusted chain hung from the porch beam, swaying faintly even though there was no wind. Ryan exhaled, voice just above a whisper. "Jesus, it's still standing." "Barely," Mason said. "Looks like the fire skipped it, or something rebuilt it after." Calloway's hand went to the grip of his sidearm. "No lights, no noise, but the dog brought us here for a reason." Ranger advanced slowly, body low, tail rigid. His muzzle brushed the ground near the door, where footprints were pressed into the damp soil, some small, others wide and deep. Mason crouched to examine them. "2 sets," he said. "One looks like police issue, the other civilian boots. Size 11, maybe 12, heel-worn flat. Someone's been here a while." The lieutenant's gray eyes narrowed. Then let's see what they left behind. He stepped onto the porch, the wood creaking beneath his boots. The door hung slightly ajar, the hinges black with rust. Calloway nudged it open with his weapon drawn. The smell hit them first, metallic, thick, the unmistakable stench of blood and rust mixed with mildew. Inside, light filtered through holes in the roof, creating pale streaks across the floor. Dust hung in the air like frozen breath. A single chair sat bolted to the warped planks, leather straps dangling from its arms. Nearby, a length of rope coiled on the floor, stiff with age and dark stains. Ryan swallowed hard. "This isn't a shelter," he whispered. "It's a holding room." Mason's jaw tightened. "No, it's a cage." Ranger circled the room, nose pressed to the ground. He stopped near the far wall where something dark was nailed to the wood. Calloway stepped closer, his flashlight beam landing on a torn piece of fabric. Navy blue ballistic weave, edges burned, a faint patch of white letters barely visible. He brushed the soot away with his glove. Ramirez. The room went silent. Mason's voice was rough when he finally spoke. "That's him." Calloway didn't answer right away. He reached out, running his fingers across the fabric. It was stiff, fused with something darker. Blood or soot, he couldn't tell. Beneath it, carved faintly into the wooden wall, were marks. Not random scratches, lines, tallies, 7 of them. Days? Prisoners? No one could say. Ryan's flashlight trembled slightly as he swept it across the floor. "There's more," he said. "Footprints, fresh. Someone's been moving through here recently." Cole Maddox's voice came through the radio from the ridge, static breaking his words. "Lawson stable, evac bird inbound. What's your position?" Calloway pressed the transmit button. "We found a cabin near the old fire line. Signs of struggle. Ramirez confirmed by tag. No hostiles in sight, but tracks are recent. Keep that bird hot." "Copy," Cole replied. "Watch your 6. That area's been off-grid for years." Ranger suddenly barked. Short, sharp, a warning. He was staring at a trap door half buried under broken boards in the far corner. His claws scraped the edges, trying to pry it open. Mason crossed the room quickly, pulling at the old iron ring set into the hatch. It resisted for a moment, then lifted with a groan, releasing a gust of cold, stale air. The beam of his flashlight revealed a narrow shaft descending into blackness. A set of rotted wooden steps vanished into the dark. Ryan peered over his shoulder. "What is that, basement?" "Cellar, maybe," Mason said, frowning. "But this place doesn't have electricity, no pipes, no reason for one." Calloway studied the opening, then looked at Ranger. The dog's hackles were raised, but he didn't back away. Instead, he stared down the steps, muscles taut. The lieutenant exhaled slowly. "Something's down there." They descended carefully, the steps creaking beneath their weight. The air grew colder, damp and heavy, carrying the scent of mold and rust. When Mason's boots hit the concrete floor, his flashlight beam caught the outline of a small underground room. The walls were rough stone, the ceiling low. In the center sat an overturned table, and beside it, a pile of blankets, blackened at the edges. Ryan stepped closer. "Sir, look at this." He pointed to a corner where a stack of old military supply crates stood, one of them pried open. Inside were food rations, expired but still sealed, and beside, them, a lantern recently used, the glass smudged with soot. "Someone's been living here," Mason said. Calloway crouched, touching the lantern's base. The metal was still faintly warm. He rose slowly, scanning the dark corners. "Then they're close, real close." Ranger whined, turning his head toward a narrow gap at the far wall. The space was just wide enough for a person to squeeze through. Calloway's light caught the faint shimmer of something metallic embedded in the rock. More marks, deliberate, almost like symbols scratched with a knife. He couldn't read them, but he didn't need to. Mason's voice was low, edged with certainty. He's been held here. Ramirez, maybe more. Ryan looked pale. But why here? There's nothing for miles. Calloway didn't answer. He turned to the stairs. Because whoever did this knows this land better than we do, and he's still out there. When they climbed back into the main room, the last light of dusk was bleeding through the broken roof. Ranger sat by the door, body tense, ears pricked toward the forest. Calloway glanced at Mason. Pack the evidence. We're not staying after dark. As they stepped outside, the forest greeted them with silence. The air smelled sharper, colder. Behind them, the cabin stood like a wounded animal, half burned but refusing to fall. Mason looked back once, the name on the torn vest still burned into his vision. Whoever built that place, he muttered. He didn't just want to kill them, he wanted to keep them. Calloway's reply came quiet, but sure. Then we find him before the forest does. Ranger gave one final bark into the trees, low, warning, resolute, before leading them once more into the mist. The night settled over the forest like a bruise, purple, heavy, and quiet. The mist had thickened again, curling through the blackened trunks in lazy ribbons that made every shape uncertain. Lieutenant Grant Calloway led the descent toward the ravine, his flashlight beam slicing through the dark. The others followed in single file, Sergeant Mason Hale behind him, then Officer Ryan Keaton, and finally Ranger, the old German shepherd, limping but determined, his amber eyes glowing faintly in the light. They had left the cabin less than 20 minutes ago, but already the woods felt tighter, more hostile. The air smelled of rust and moss, each step crunched on ash and damp leaves. Calloway's voice broke the silence, low and steady. We move quiet. If Ramirez is alive, he's close. If not, someone still is. Ranger stopped suddenly near a split in the ground, ears pricking forward. A faint sound drifted up from below, a human sound, a groan. Mason lifted his fist, signaling a halt. He crouched beside the drop. You hear that? Ryan leaned closer, squinting through the dark. It's someone calling. Another sound followed, weak, ragged breathing. Then a whisper. Help, please. Calloway's pulse kicked. Flashlight down, he ordered. Mason angled the beam toward the ravine floor. The light fell on two figures lying half-buried under brush and broken branches. Their uniforms were filthy, torn, but unmistakably Seabridge Police tactical gear. One man's badge caught the light. Officer Tate Reynolds, a stocky patrolman in his 30s with a square jaw, pale skin streaked with blood, and cropped blonde hair. The other, thinner, was Officer Ben Harker, early 40s, olive skin, dark beard matted with dirt, his left leg twisted unnaturally beneath him. Mason's breath left him in a tight exhale. That's Bravo team, he muttered. They're alive. Ryan's voice cracked. Holy hell, how? Doesn't matter, Calloway said. We get them out. He clipped a rope to a nearby tree and rappelled halfway down, boots scraping the slope. Mason followed, lowering Ryan beside him. Ranger stayed at the top, pacing the edge, whining softly. When Calloway reached the bottom, he knelt beside Reynolds, pressing 2 fingers to his neck. Pulse. Weak but there. He turned to Harker, whose eyelids fluttered open. Harker's voice rasped like gravel. Don't. Go loud. Easy, Calloway said. We've got you. Harker's eyes rolled toward the darkness beyond the ravine. He's still here. Before Calloway could ask, a noise cracked through the trees above, a twig snapping, deliberate. Ranger barked once, sharp and angry. Mason looked up, hand instinctively on his weapon. "We're not alone." The forest erupted in motion. A figure lunged from the brush near the ridge. A man, tall and lean, his silhouette jagged in the light. His clothes were a patchwork of torn flannel and canvas, streaked with grime. In one hand he held a rusted hunting knife, the blade chipped and dark with old blood. His face appeared for a split second. Sunken cheeks, wild beard, eyes a pale, almost colorless blue that glinted like ice. Ranger launched forward before anyone else could move, teeth flashing. The man swung the knife, but the dog hit him mid-chest, knocking him backward into the dirt. The struggle was violent, fast, a blur of movement and snarls. "Ranger!" Mason shouted, scrambling up the slope. He reached the ridge just as the man struck the dog across the flank with the knife's handle. Ranger yelped, but held his ground, growling deep and low. Calloway climbed up behind Mason, sidearm drawn. "Drop it," he barked. The stranger froze, chest heaving. In the flashlight beam his face was clearer now, filthy but unmistakably human, if only barely. He looked to be in his mid-50s, gaunt, his skin weathered like bark. His beard was streaked with gray, and one eye twitched slightly, as if it had never fully healed from an old injury. "Put the knife down," Calloway repeated. The man's lips cracked into a grimace that wasn't quite a smile. His voice came out rough, uneven. "They shouldn't have come here. None of you should have." Ryan climbed up beside them, gun raised, breath shaking. "Who the hell are you?" The man tilted his head, gaze flicking to Ranger, who growled again, blood dripping from a shallow cut on his shoulder. "I live where you shouldn't," he said simply. Mason stepped forward, eyes narrowing. "Name?" "Henry Lark." The name landed with an odd weight. Calloway recognized it. Lark had once worked as a construction foreman during the wildfire recovery. He'd vanished after the second wave of burns. Rumor said he'd lost his family in the blaze and gone off-grid. "You were on the fire line," Calloway said quietly. Lark's jaw tightened. "I was the fire line." He raised his hand slightly, still holding the knife. "The forest remembers. It keeps what it wants." "Put it down," Mason warned. "Now." But before the man could answer, Ranger lunged again, this time not to attack, but to block. From the corner of his eye, Calloway saw movement, a second knife glinting from Lark's belt. Mason reacted fast, kicking the blade from his grasp and tackling him to the ground. The knife spun into the dirt, landing inches from Ranger's paw. "Get his pack," Calloway ordered. Ryan grabbed the man's weather-beaten rucksack and yanked it open. Inside were lengths of nylon cord, a folding saw, 2 rusted knives, and a small leather collar, cracked with age, its tag long worn away. Mason picked it up, his brows furrowing. "Sir, this belonged to a dog." Ranger stepped forward, sniffing it. His ears twitched, then lowered. A faint whine escaped him, a sound halfway between grief and recognition. Ryan frowned. "That's his, isn't it?" Calloway studied the Suha collar, the faint engraving barely legible under grime. He rubbed the surface clean enough to read one word burned into the leather. Ranger. For a moment, no one spoke. Mason's voice came quiet. "He was one of ours once." Lark's laugh broke the silence, a hollow, fractured sound. "Yours?" He was hers. She saved him. The woman in the fire, Nora Whitfield. You remember that name, don't you, Lieutenant? Calloway froze. The name struck him like a memory he'd buried deep. Nora Whitfield had been a field medic, small, sharp-eyed, with red hair and a habit of humming when she stitched wounds. She'd vanished the night the ridge burned, presumed dead with her rescue team. "How do you know that name?" Calloway demanded. Lark's pale eyes gleamed. Because I was there when the fire took her, and I was there when this dog came back for her." Ranger's growl deepened, a low rumble that carried something close to fury. Mason pulled Lark upright, hand gripping his collar. "You're coming with us." Lark didn't resist. He looked past them, toward the burned horizon, and said softly, "She's still here, you know. The forest doesn't let go." Calloway felt a chill crawl up his spine despite himself. "Cuff him. We'll let the facts talk." They tied Lark's hands and led him toward the ravine, where Reynolds and Harker waited under makeshift blankets. As they reached the clearing, the med-evac lights from Cole's position flickered faintly through the fog in the distance, a promise of escape. Mason threw a glance over his shoulder at the prisoner. "What did you do to them, Lark?" But the man only smiled, slow and hollow. "I didn't kill your men. I just watched the forest decide who stayed." As the team began the long climb out, Ranger walked beside Mason, limping but unyielding. In his eyes burned something human, anger, memory, and something that looked a lot like grief. When they reached the ridge, Calloway turned once more toward the burned valley. Somewhere below, the wind moved through the hollow trees like a whisper of unfinished stories. And behind them, the man who called himself Henry Lark began to hum, a broken tune that made the forest seem even darker. The rescue chopper had long since vanished into the clouds, leaving behind only the echo of its blades and the smell of jet fuel. Night had thickened again over the burned ridge, swallowing sound and color. Lieutenant Grant Calloway stood in the clearing beside the bound man, Henry Lark, who sat slumped against a charred log, wrists cuffed, eyes vacant. The two rescued officers, Reynolds and Harker, had been flown out minutes earlier, leaving the forest eerily quiet. The mist swirled around the group. Calloway, Sergeant Mason Hale, young Ryan Keaton, and the dog who now stood at the center of everything. Ranger. The German shepherd sat still as stone, his fur matted and streaked with ash. His breathing was slow but steady. His gaze, however, fixed on the leather collar lying in Calloway's gloved hands. It was cracked and dark with age, the metal tag nearly obscured by grime. Calloway wiped it gently with his thumb, and the faint engraving caught the weak light. Ranger. He froze. His pulse stuttered. The world seemed to go still around him. Mason noticed first. "You okay, Lieutenant?" Calloway didn't answer immediately. He stared at the name as though it had reached across time to touch him. The memory came unbidden. A briefing room 7 years earlier, the wildfire season of 2018. Nora Whitfield. She had been 30 then, a nurse volunteering with the emergency response unit during the Seabridge blaze. Auburn hair that caught sunlight like copper, freckles across her nose, green eyes that never looked away when people spoke. She was the kind who smiled through exhaustion, who carried water and bandages for miles without complaint. And the dog, Ranger, a police K-9 once trained for search and rescue, but dismissed for independent temperament. Nora had adopted him, saying, "Every soldier deserves a second chance, even the stubborn ones." Calloway remembered the night they lost her. The fire had shifted fast, cutting off the evacuation route near the eastern ridge. Her radio went silent at 2146. Ranger had been seen running back toward the blaze after the last transmission. Neither was found. Only ashes and melted glass where her camp used to be. Now the name was here, on a collar that should have burned away years ago. Mason's voice was low. "That's his name, isn't it? The dog's?" Calloway nodded slowly, his throat dry. "Yeah. Ranger." Ryan glanced between them, his youthful face pale in the dim light. "Then, this isn't just some stray. He belonged to her." Ranger took a step forward. The old dog's amber eyes met Calloway's, then dropped to the collar. He sniffed it once, then lowered his head to the ground. It wasn't submission. It was recognition, a quiet, deliberate moment of memory. Mason crouched beside him, voice gentle. He remembers. Henry Lark laughed then, a hollow, rasping sound that broke the silence like a crack in glass. Of course he remembers, he said. The forest keeps everything, every scent, every name, every promise. She never left, you know. Calloway turned sharply toward him. Enough riddles. You said you saw her. What did you mean? Lark looked up slowly, his pale eyes almost reflective in the dark. Not saw. Felt. You don't walk these woods without feeling her. She's part of it now. The nurse, the fire, the dog, all burned into the bones of this place. Mason's patience snapped. You're talking like a man who's lost his grip. Start making sense or I'll have you talking to a federal shrink by sunrise. Lark smiled faintly, a sad, uneven curl of his mouth. Sense? He looked toward Ranger. You think sense built this world? Fire did. Pain did. That dog's been walking this forest for years, searching, not lost, searching, always for her. Ranger growled low, the sound vibrating through his chest. It wasn't directed at Lark. It was older, deeper, a sound that seemed to echo from memory itself. Calloway knelt beside the dog, setting the collar in the dirt between them. You brought us this, didn't you, boy? Ranger's ears twitched. You led us to Ramirez, to Lawson, to that cabin. You remembered. Mason stood silent behind them, his broad shoulders tense. The wind shifted, carrying the faint smell of pine and old smoke. For a moment, the lieutenant swore he could hear something under it. A woman's voice, faint, carried in the wind. Ryan whispered, You think he came back for her? Calloway nodded slowly. Or maybe for what she started. The radio on Mason's shoulder crackled to life, Cole Maddox's voice cutting through static. Command wants status. What's your position? Mason pressed the button. Ridgeline secure. 2 survivors evac. 1 suspect detained. We found something else. He looked at Calloway for confirmation. The lieutenant met his eyes, then spoke into the mic. Copy that, Cole. We're bringing it in. They turned toward the vehicle parked along the ridge, a single SUV, headlights cutting faint cones through the mist. Calloway guided Lark forward, Mason following with the evidence bag. Ranger padded quietly beside them, favoring his injured leg, but refusing to lag behind. Halfway to the vehicle, Ryan spoke softly. Sir, what happens to him now? The dog, I mean. Calloway glanced down at Ranger. We'll take him back to the station for now. He's earned better than the woods. But even as he said it, he wasn't sure the dog would stay. When they reached the SUV, Mason opened the rear hatch and helped Lark inside, securing the cuffs to the frame. The man didn't resist. He only stared out into the trees, murmuring under his breath. You'll see. She's still waiting. You'll see when the fire comes back. Ryan shifted uneasily. He's crazy. Calloway shut the door firmly. Maybe, but crazy people tell the truth sometimes. As Mason loaded the gear, Calloway crouched near Ranger. The old shepherd's fur caught the beam from the taillight, silvering his face. You knew her, didn't you? He said quietly. You came back because she couldn't. The dog tilted his head, and for a heartbeat, Calloway thought he saw understanding in those eyes, a flicker of recognition, of purpose that hadn't dimmed in 7 years. He reached out, placing a hand on the animal's scarred shoulder. You did good, Ranger. The shepherd leaned forward, pressing his muzzle briefly against Calloway's hand before looking back towards the dark forest. The wind picked up again, whistling through the dead trees. Somewhere far off, thunder rolled across the coast, the smell of ozone mixed with ash. Mason climbed into the driver's seat. "Storm's coming," he said. Calloway nodded, his gaze still on Ranger. "Yeah, and I've got a feeling it's bringing more than rain." They drove in silence down the dirt road, the fog swallowing the taillights until only the faint glow of the headlights cut through the dark. Ranger sat in the back, his eyes never leaving the window, watching the forest recede behind them, watching as if it still held something he couldn't yet leave behind. Behind them, in the clearing, the wind lifted a scatter of ashes from the ground. They swirled once, briefly forming a shape, thin, human, almost feminine, before vanishing into the mist. The first light of dawn broke over Seabridge like a promise the world was trying to keep. The storm had passed in the night, leaving the town washed clean but trembling beneath gray skies. The smell of rain mixed with salt from the Atlantic, and the streets glistened like wet glass. Outside the Seabridge Police Department, the flag flapped lazily in the early wind. Inside, silence reigned, a silence made heavier by everything that had happened in the past 48 hours. Lieutenant Grant Calloway stood by the operations board, his uniform damp at the collar, his eyes shadowed with exhaustion. He had slept barely 2 hours, but his mind refused to slow. Reports were coming in. Statements from the rescued officers, medical assessments, even federal inquiries about Henry Lark and the forest site. Yet none of it felt finished. Something about it all hung suspended, unresolved, like a breath held too long. On the metal table before him lay the leather collar, cleaned and tagged as evidence. Its brass plate caught the flicker of fluorescent light, and for a moment Calloway saw not the room around him, but a flicker of firelight, and a woman's voice echoing through smoke. "You'll find him, won't you? He's not like the others. He remembers." He blinked hard, pushing the thought aside. The sound of boots drew his attention. Sergeant Mason Hale entering with his usual quiet authority. Mason's tall frame filled the doorway, his shirt sleeves rolled, exposing forearms marked with old scars. His face looked older today, the edges of his beard showing gray that hadn't been there before. He carried a file folder and a paper coffee cup, which he set beside the lieutenant. "Preliminary reports are in," Mason said. "Reynolds and Harker are stable. Command signed off on Lark's transfer. They'll move him to county lockup by noon." Calloway nodded. "And the dog?" "He's out back." Mason's expression softened. "Doc Price says he'll walk fine in a few weeks. He patched the paw, gave him a mild sedative. Stubborn bastard wouldn't stay still long enough to rest." Calloway allowed a rare, tired smile. "Sounds about right." They walked through the hallway toward the rear lot. The building buzzed faintly with early morning life, phones ringing, radios murmuring. A few officers paused to nod respectfully, eyes lingering with quiet gratitude on their commanding officer. Word had spread fast, how the old shepherd had led them through the burned forest, how he'd found the missing men when no human could. When they stepped outside, the air was crisp and pale gold with sunrise. The yard backed against the charred tree line that still marked the fire's edge. There, lying on a clean gray blanket beside a heating lamp, was Ranger. His coat had been brushed, revealing streaks of gray that blended with the black along his back. The bandages on his paw were neat, the white contrasting with the dark fur. His eyes, though, half-lidded with fatigue, still carried the same steady intelligence that had guided them through the mist. Kneeling beside him was Lieutenant Daniel Price, the department's medical officer. He was in his mid-30s, lanky and soft-spoken, with wire-framed glasses and brown hair that perpetually refused to stay combed. His uniform jacket hung loose on his thin frame, and his voice always carried the calm of a man who'd seen enough pain to understand silence better than words. Price glanced up when he saw them. "He's healing," he said. "Tougher than most men I've treated this week." Mason crouched, running a hand along the shepherd's neck. "Guess he's earned his rest." Ranger stirred, lifting his head slightly at the sound of Mason's voice. His tail thumped once against the ground. Calloway knelt opposite. "You did good, boy," he said softly. "You brought them home." The dog's gaze lingered on him, then drifted toward the distant tree line, where the first rays of sunlight touched the charred trunks. He let out a faint sigh, a sound so human it almost hurt to hear. Price stood, brushing off his gloves. "He'll stay here a few days. After that, well, I suppose that's up to you, Lieutenant. You planning to keep him?" Calloway hesitated. The idea of bringing Ranger home, of giving him a quiet yard and a warm floor, sounded right, but somehow incomplete. This dog wasn't meant for stillness. His purpose had been carved by fire and loss, and he had fulfilled it by leading them through both. Mason seemed to read the thought. "He's not meant for retirement," he said quietly. Calloway nodded. "No, but he's earned something better." Later that morning, a small ceremony gathered in the station yard. It wasn't formal, just a dozen officers, a few civilians, and the mayor, Evelyn Dorsey, a short, strong-willed woman in her 50s with chestnut hair and the measured tone of someone who believed deeply in duty. She wore a dark trench coat over her tailored suit, rain still clinging to the shoulders. Her presence alone quieted the murmurs. "Today," she began, "we honor more than service. We honor loyalty, the kind that doesn't ask for reward or recognition." She glanced toward Ranger, who sat beside Calloway now, his chest bandaged but head high. "This dog carried a message through ash and fear, led our men back from death, and reminded us that courage doesn't always wear a badge." Mason stepped forward, holding a small box. Inside was a polished medallion attached to a leather strap. The inscription was simple: "For valor, Seabridge Police." He fastened it gently around Ranger's neck, the metal glinting faintly in the light. The gathered officers applauded softly, not the wild cheering of crowds, but the steady rhythm of respect. Ranger didn't bark or move. He simply stood, tail low, ears perked, watching each face as if he understood. After the ceremony, Calloway remained in the yard as people dispersed. The fog had burned away now, revealing the charred skeleton of the forest beyond the fence. Ranger walked slowly toward it, his gait uneven but strong. He stopped near the gate and sat, facing the blackened trees. The lieutenant followed, standing a few feet behind. "He comes here every morning," Price said quietly, stepping beside him. "Since we brought him in, just sits there, staring into the woods." Calloway's gaze softened. "Maybe he's still waiting. For her." The lieutenant nodded once. "For her, for peace, for something he'll never quite find." A long silence stretched between them. Somewhere beyond the ridge, a single gull cried, the sound carried by the wind. As the sun climbed higher, its rays cut through the haze, landing squarely on Ranger's scarred shoulder. The light shimmered gold against the rough fur, making it look for a moment like a small flame that refused to die. Mason appeared from behind, his voice steady but soft. "You think he knows she's gone?" Calloway's answer came after a pause. "He doesn't need to. He just knows he's supposed to keep watch." They stood in silence for a long while, 3 figures and a dog framed against the edge of a forest that had once burned hotter than hell itself. Finally, Calloway turned back toward the station. "Come on, Mason. Let him be." Ranger didn't move. His amber eyes followed the tree line, unblinking, as though waiting for a figure to step from the ashes. And maybe, in the way that legends are born, some part of him believed she still would. By noon, the town of Seabridge had returned to its ordinary rhythm. Boats rocking in the harbor, gulls circling over the docks, radios crackling with static and news. But for those who knew, the story spread quietly. Of the dog who had walked out of the fire, carrying a blood-soaked boot, of the officers he'd saved, of the name engraved on his collar. They began calling him the Guardian of Seabridge. And every morning, as the sun climbed over the Atlantic, the old shepherd could be seen sitting at the edge of the burned forest, the golden light glinting off his scars. Proof that memory, like fire, never truly dies. Sometimes miracles don't arrive with trumpets or angels. Sometimes they walk on 4 legs, scarred, silent, and loyal beyond reason. Ranger wasn't just a dog who survived fire and loss. He was a reminder that God's grace often appears in the smallest acts of courage, in the quiet persistence of love that refuses to die. Maybe you've felt like you've walked through your own burned forest. Loneliness, grief, hardship that left scars no one can see. But if you keep faith, if you keep walking, God always sends a guide, sometimes in the form of a friend, a memory, or a loyal heart that leads you home. So tonight, before you close your eyes, take a moment to thank God for the guardians in your life, both the people and the loyal souls He places along your path. And if this story touched your heart, don't keep it to yourself. Share it, leave a comment, and subscribe to help stories like Ranger's reach others who might need a little reminder that miracles still happen. May God bless you, protect your family, and keep the fire of faith alive in your heart.